The historic city of Bath. Situated in the southwest of England, the city of Bath is renowned throughout the world for its Georgian architecture and natural hot springs. The city's history is rich and varied, but it's the Roman occupation of the city, which they named Aqua Sulis, that stirs the imagination of hundreds of tourists that flock to the city each and every year. In 1987, the city of Bath was awarded World Heritage status, and it isn't difficult to see why. Simply take a look at just a small selection of the architectural wonders that the city has to offer. The Royal Crescent, for example, Pulteney Bridge, or Bath Bus Station, which was recently honoured by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. In spite of these and other stunning buildings, such as Sally Lunn's tea rooms, there is still another magnificent structure that stands out as the city's crowning glory. That structure is Bath Abbey. The history of this magnificent building has been well documented. However, this film will not be focusing on the easily accessible history of the Abbey, but instead we have endeavoured to unearth some of the events in the Abbey's past which until now have remained forgotten secrets. As you can probably imagine, the research for this film was a long and extensive process. It was surprising to find, however, just how much information the Bath City Library had hidden away in its dustiest volumes. By pooling together our finds from these paper archives, as well as discoveries from our crack team of microfilm specialists, we have whittled our discoveries down to the top 5 most interesting secrets from the Abbey's past. The construction of Bath Abbey as it appears today began in the year 1499 under the order of the Bishop of Bath and Wells, Oliver King. Before the current abbey was built, a grand cathedral stood on the same site. This cathedral was actually larger in scale than today's abbey and was completed at some time around the year 1156. When Oliver King became the Bishop of Bath and Wells in 1496, he was shocked to find the Cathedral of Bath close to ruin. The newly appointed bishop spent a year pondering what to do about the decaying building, and toyed with the idea of building an entirely new church on the site. Popular historical records claim that the bishop one night had a dream that finally convinced him to build a new church on the site. In this dream, Bishop King saw a ladder stretching up to heaven, with angels climbing and descending, and at the ladder's base, an olive tree with a crown hanging from its branches. To the bishop, the olive tree and crown were blatant symbolism of his own name, Oliver King, and as such he felt he was divinely chosen to rebuild the ruined cathedral. Construction on the abbey began in 1499 and wasn't completed until 1525. Unfortunately, Oliver King died in 1503, so he never got to see the finished abbey. As a mark to his memory, the images from his dream were incorporated into the design of the abbey frontage. With its many and varied decorative carvings, the magnificent abbey frontage is still a hugely impressive sight to this day. Of all the splendid and elaborate decoration, it is the twin ladders of ascending and descending angels that have always held the most fascination for visitors to the abbey. The story of the bishop's dream is still told today and is usually presented as historic fact. Even local museums carry the story as part of their exhibits. However, despite the story being accurate to a certain extent, it is a little-known fact that the whole tale is never revealed. The truth of the matter is that the original story came to light more than a century after Oliver King's death. Original transcripts of Bishop King's diary tell of the dream also containing images of the olive tree burning to the ground, and the crown falling from the branches and rolling into a lake. In fact, in light of the whole story, Bishop King seems to have decided to build the new abbey despite having the dream, which was actually full of bad omens of impending failure. Perhaps Bishop King's death in 1503 was fate exacting its revenge on him for acting against doom-laden premonitions he had been shown in his prophetic dream. Some may scoff at such a superstitious suggestion, but was it really a coincidence that just a few short years after the abbey was completed, Henry VIII began the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539? The property of all monastic institutions throughout the country was confiscated, and Bath Abbey was no exception. The abbey was stripped of everything of value, even its lead roofing. Once again, another magnificent church on this site was left to fall into ruin. Wartime Britain, 1942. Bombing raids over England were commonplace and had become part of a terrifying and arduous daily wartime routine. The city of Bath, with its rich history and lack of military installations, had been classified as one of a small number of national safe havens. Because of Bath's apparent safety, the city was chosen for a very special purpose, which aimed to raise national morale and in turn help the war effort. In January of 1942, the English government's Minister for Supply, Lord Beaverbrook, was given the task of relocating Britain's most treasured item to the safety of the city of Bath. After much debate and argument in the House of Commons, the item that was deemed to be most influential to national morale was finalised on the 28th of January 1942. The final decision was that the steam locomotive, the Flying Scotsman, was the single most important source of national pride, and therefore critical to keeping national morale stable. It was thought that if the Flying Scotsman were to be destroyed in a bombing raid, it would cause national panic and destabilise the war effort. On April the 22nd, 1942, the Flying Scotsman arrived in the city of Bath, and preparations were made to house the locomotive within the confines of Bath Abbey. The Abbey had been deemed the safest place in the city, and was also thought to be far from the gaze of the Nazi eye. On the 23rd of April 1942, one publicity photograph was taken of the event, and was to be published in national newspapers to boost the morale of the nation. At around this time, the British Air Force had been conducting bombing raids on the historic German city of Lübeck. The Allied forces had been under the impression that the city was harbouring troops preparing for an assault on the Russian front. Damage to the historic city of Lübeck was severe, and the city's cathedral and main churches were destroyed. Under Hitler's instruction, the German Luftwaffe retaliated with a series of air raids. The historic English cities of Exeter, York, Norwich and Bath were chosen as targets. The only reasoning behind this choice of cities was that they all scored the maximum 4-star rating in the German tourist guides printed by the Baedeker Company. Bath Abbey had suddenly become a prime bombing target. On the nights of April the 25th and April the 26th, 1942, Bath was subject to 2 sustained and heavy bombing raids. A panicked government mobilised a swift and clumsy removal of the Flying Scotsman from Bath Abbey. In the rush to remove the locomotive, a priceless 17th century leather glove was irreparably damaged. The publicity photograph was never published, but the Abbey was subsequently employed for storage of another kind. It was decided that the Abbey was ideally suited to the stockpiling of food supplies on a massive scale, and by June 1942, the Abbey was primarily storing several tons of beef dripping and suet. The summer of 1976. Professor Lionel Tobin, a little-known writer and self-proclaimed expert in the paranormal, began research for his 5th non-fiction book concerning the world of the unexplained. Professor Tobin's previous works had found modest success. His first book, entitled Ghosts Drew My Nan, was a collection of psychic artwork accompanied by the professor's essays. His following books covered subject areas such as UFOs, pixies and poltergeists, but even the most staunch believers found his works to be full of fantastical claims backed up by very little evidence. In May 1976, Professor Tobin spent a week conducting a paranormal investigation into Bath Abbey. An agreement with the parish and the local council had been struck, and it was deemed that any results from Professor Tobin's research would be a boon for the tourist industry of Bath. After the week of investigation came to a close, Professor Tobin leaked one of his own photographs to the Evening Chronicle newspaper. The photograph showed what Professor Tobin claimed to be a Sasquatch, prowling around the pews of the Abbey. The photograph caught not only the eye of local residents, but also the sceptical eye of BAPS, the British Association of Parapsychologists based at the University of Leeds. Bapps had been following Professor Tobin's work for many years and had always been highly suspicious of his amazing claims and dubious methods. Bapps members invited Professor Tobin to present his findings to a panel of Bapps experts. Claiming he had nothing to hide, Professor Tobin took them up on their invite and also agreed to make some of his photographs available for analysis. At Professor Tobin's lengthy presentation, he revealed a catalogue of paranormal phenomena centred around Bath Abbey. Highlights ranged from the appearance of a swearing monk who had mouthed profanities without causing any audible swears, through to the visitation of aliens, who Tobin claimed came to take photographs of the stained-glass windows in an effort to better understand staining techniques. Professor Tobin left the presentation that day extremely pleased with the way things had gone. Unfortunately for Professor Tobin, the Bapps investigators eventually found every piece of his so-called evidence to be entirely fabricated. For example, Professor Tobin's photos of UFOs were analysed by a special computer, and when certain images were enlarged and enhanced, the image of a dog was revealed on the underside of the craft. It transpired that Tobin had used a collector's edition plate to mimic a UFO in flight. The plate, which commemorated 100 years of the appearance of dogs on porcelain, was found to be one of 12 that had been reported missing from a local charity shop. Professor Tobin's ghost photographs were another good example of his deception. Most of these images were actually pictures of nothing more amazing than people hiding under sheets. When advanced photographic analysis proved that the apparitions had been faked, Tobin conceded that they were indeed bedsheets, but remained adamant that it was ghosts and not people hiding beneath them. Bapps stripped Lionel Tobin of his professorship and entirely ruined his reputation in the field of paranormal research. Ironically, just a few short months after the Tobin incident, Bapps published a survey which revealed that Bath Abbey actually rated as the least haunted site in the whole of Britain. Even a Derbyshire-based hen house and a Cornish telephone booth rated higher on the list of reported hauntings. The only genuine unexplained report from Bath Abbey that Bapps are aware of is of a woman reporting an unfathomable manure-like smell in the cloisters. Understandably, this does not constitute a hotbed of paranormal phenomena. In March 1988, with the end of the financial year looming, Bath City Council was in a dire financial state. After years of fund mismanagement and reckless expenditure on ridiculous tourist attractions, the council found itself desperate for fresh funds. Past ideas for tourist attractions, such as the world's tallest cello, simply accelerated the fund's crisis and actually scared tourists away. The council knew that radical ideas were needed to turn the situation around. Behind the closed doors of the city's Guild Hall, a scheme was devised which would allow the city's historic properties to be hired for commercial events. Named the History for Hire scheme, the list of properties made available was extensive. At the very top of this list was Bath Abbey. With its vast capacity and large front loading bay, the Abbey was ideally suited to large exhibitions and conventions. The 1989 Powerboat and Jet Ski Expo was the first event to be successfully hosted in the Abbey. With the large capacity Abbey now available for hire, it soon caught the eye of a large community of local rave organisers. The Atlantean Bliss Rave Collective were currently holding their large-scale events illegally in fields and barns throughout Somerset. The events were not ideal, and the organisers had grown tired of the constant police raids and startled cattle that always conspired to ruin the events. The availability of the Abbey as a venue was perfectly timed for Atlantean Bliss, who were looking to turn their raves into a 100% legal venture. Unfamiliar with the acid house scene and its ingrained drug culture, Bath City Council gave Atlantean Bliss the go-ahead, and the first rave was held in the Abbey on the 10th of August 1990. Overnight, Bath Abbey literally went from this to this. Called the Acid Temple Rave, the event attracted ravers from across the whole country, and the Abbey was close to a capacity crowd. Local residents were up in arms, the main complaint being that the excessive volume and thumping bass was causing widespread property damage and nausea in the elderly. Council officials did enforce a slight volume restriction on future proceedings, but as the council were taking a 40% cut of all profits, as well as the agreed hire fee, they let the raves continue, much to the anger of the local residents' association. Over the course of a year, Atlantean Bliss became an influential force in the British rave scene. By the time of the second annual Easter mashup, their events had high-profile sponsorship and were featuring such renowned artists as DJ Slow Clocks, John Timms, and 90s DJ collective the Siamese Acid Orphanage. Unfortunately for Atlantean Bliss, the inherent drug culture of the rave scene was to be their downfall. Local residents had expressed concern at the apparent trade of counterfeit postage stamps at the events, with revellers seemingly paying inflated prices to taste Her Majesty's glue. When the police finally took action, they found that the stamps were in fact so-called acid tabs, and that ravers were telling themselves daffy. Unsurprisingly, the Abbey rave scene was shut down for good, and Bath City Council scrapped the History for Hire scheme entirely for fear of future abuse of the venture. The final secret in our top 5 countdown is a secret that is soon to be made public by Bath City Council and the Abbey's own Heritage Foundation. The story of this final secret dates back to the year 1382, although it wasn't until February 2006 that the discovery was made. As the Abbey was undergoing a substantial refit of its ageing heating systems, a workman accidentally demolished a small brick wall in the Abbey's vaults. Other than a terrific smell of old wheat, the tiny room that was revealed seemed to contain little more than rubble and dust. It wasn't until the room was cleared that an old leather-bound book was found amongst the debris. Even after a cursory evaluation of the book, it was clear that this book was of tremendous historical importance. Further research was conducted into the mysterious Anglo-Saxon text, and it was soon announced that the book was the oldest example of its kind in the whole world. What the workmen had accidentally uncovered was the world's oldest book of jokes. With such a historic treasure on their hands, the Abbey Heritage Foundation decided that they should create a new visitor attraction surrounding the book and its mysterious history. It is this attraction that is scheduled to open to the public in the first half of 2007. The origins of this book are somewhat mysterious. Only a small foreword dated 1382 in the volume itself talks briefly of local monks handwriting the volume over the course of several years. Surprisingly, jokes from this ancient volume are still in common circulation today, and form the backbone of most jokes that you will hear in school playgrounds and offices throughout the land. The knock-knock joke format, for example, can be found within the pages of this ancient volume. The original knock-knock jokes featured an additional knock, and they are thought to have originated from the practice of villagers annoying local guardsmen. It may come as a surprise to learn that many contemporary comedians, such as Arthur Cribbs, the brothers Tutu and Scotch Donald, can have their jokes traced back to this very volume. While many of the jokes within this old tome still stir amusement today, it seems that a small percentage of them have lost their meaning over the intervening centuries. The following jokes are good examples of this. With what does a baker bake his wares? A baker's grin. What's be worse than milk on Wednesday? Milk on Friday. Jokes such as these seem to have lost their meaning entirely. With this long-lost book from the Abbey's past now about to be made public, perhaps we will soon see a growing interest in the other secrets of Bath Abbey. Whether this will happen remains to be seen, but we can only hope that this short film has helped to raise awareness of just a few of these fascinating secrets. Thank you for watching.